I'm Kim Vidal. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, as oil prices slump, economies shrink and austerity kicks in, is this the end of the Middle East's oil rush? Also this week, South Africa's unemployment hit a record high before the pandemic. What's gone wrong for an economy that emerged from the 2008 financial crisis in a strong position? When you try to reinvent the wheel, but turns out you may simply be the world's largest taxi firm. Is this the end of the gig economy? Uber fights labour laws in courts around the world. The world's economies are moving away from fossil fuels. Right now, being an oil-producing nation is a tricky proposition, burning through money set aside for a rainy day and borrowing money from international investors to make sure you can pay your bills. It's also a time many big oil companies are thinking about leaving more oil in the ground. Many countries have failed to wean themselves off oil, struggling to diversify their economies. Oil revenues in the Middle East and North Africa fell from over $1 trillion in 2012 to $575 billion in 2019. That's according to the IMF. And this year, Middle East producers are expected to earn $270 billion less in oil revenue. At the same time, Middle East oil exporting economies are expected to contract 7.3%. Just as an example, the biggest economy, Saudi Arabia, is predicted to have a budget deficit of $112 billion this year, which is a record, according to Saudi Jadwa Investment Group. The government has tripled value-added tax from 5% to 15% and has cut its cost of living allowance for state employees from June of this year. That amounted to about $267 a month for two-thirds of the country's employees. Still, Saudi Finance Minister Mohammed Al-Jadaan says the kingdom may have to borrow $60 billion to cover the huge budget deficit. Saudi Arabia isn't the only country struggling. With oil prices trading at around $40 a barrel, it means countries like Algeria are stretched, to say the least. It needs oil at $157 a barrel just to make ends meet. The only nation that can balance its budget at $40 is Qatar. So can the Middle East see the writing on the wall? An end to the age of oil is coming. Well, Al Jazeera's Heidi Jo Castro met with Jihad Azur in Washington, D.C. He is the director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department at the International Monetary Fund. She began by asking him, are Middle East oil exporters doing enough to diversify?
Well, diversification has different meanings. You have the fiscal diversifications, and countries in the GCC have already started that with the introduction of the value-added tax as well as also other fiscal measures. Some are still preparing and they are in process of doing this. We encourage them to accelerate that. There is also the sectoral diversification, which also with Vision 2030 and other medium-term programs, government has already started to introduce that. And the third level of diversification is the diversification of economic enablers, or I would say driver for growth. And technology, for example, is one area. Promoting and developing SMEs is also another avenue where countries in the last few years have introduced certain number of programs. But we have also to recognize that diversification is a long process. And this process had made a bit more difficult with the COVID. We think that going forward, what is important is to accelerate investment in technology, have an environmental-led growth, and also improve business environment. And those three elements, with investing in education, investing in healthcare, will allow those countries to have a healthy and strong diversification programs.
What are the hurdles for diversification? Why is it such a long process?
Because you are, in fact, investing in the long cycles. You need to have the enablers for that. Human capital is an important dimension, and it takes time to do this. You need to adjust some of your laws, labor laws. And also, especially if you're investing in startups, SMEs, this takes time for those new ventures to grow. But those are the steps that goes in the right direction. And this has to be done simultaneously with improving some of the doing business indicators, and also investing and accelerating investment in technology and investment in green energy and green recovery.
With this pandemic ongoing, oil prices still at a very low range, What are your growth prospects for these Middle Eastern countries?
Those two shocks led to one of the most severe crises that the region has to endure. In less than 1 year, we saw a drop in economic activity that was not seen in the last decades. Of course, government reacted very rapidly in order to address the impact of this shock on lives and livelihoods by introducing certain number of measures to protect the life of people through social distancing and other healthcare measures. In parallel to that, government have also initiated certain number of fiscal and monetary stimulus in order to address the impact of this crisis on livelihood of people, on economic activity, and also in providing liquidity to the financial system. This has helped, but yet we expect growth this year to be negative, on average by more than 5%. Of course, it's different between countries, and oil exporting countries were more affected than the oil importing countries.
You mentioned the value-added tax. That's a new thing for some of these countries. How is it being implemented, and so far, would you say it's working to fund these governments?
As you know, there are 3 countries who have already introduced it: Saudi, UAE, and Bahrain. Others are preparing it. It proved to be simple to implement, and the revenue impact was relatively acceptable. It came at a time where the economy was not growing fast, and therefore it may have had an impact when it was introduced. But this is a step in the right direction. It helps diversify the source of revenues. It helps also introduce a tax that is neutral sectorally, and also it helps create some discipline in the way public resources are being used. Of course, this is a step in the right direction, but it's not the only step that is needed.
And then if we do have a second wave of COVID in the Middle East, do you think these economies can survive, and how?
Well, the first wave showed us that countries were efficient in managing the first wave. They have introduced swiftly strong and stringent measures to protect lives. And those who started early were able to open up earlier. And also we saw an investment in the healthcare infrastructure. And this is something that is very useful going forward. What is going to be important is how to balance between opening up and protecting lives. How to make sure that some of the services are done remotely. Education is an important one. Delivering public services, as well as also helping some of the sectors that were hardly hit, like tourism, transportation, to recover. And above all is how to help talents to get recycled into the new sectors of the economy.
And then, of course, we have the oil importing countries. We have Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon. How do you think they'll fare?
Well, here I think each country is different. Of course, the drop in oil price was useful for them on reducing the cost of energy. But on the other hand, remittances, investment flows, and tourism flows went down. Each country has its own, I would say, framework of actions that is needed going forward. Countries who have introduced reforms, like Egypt, were able to, while addressing the impact of the COVID, keep the economy functioning. Others need, like Lebanon, a strong reform agenda in order to restore confidence and address one of the most severe crises that Lebanon has endured over the last decades.
Well, Lebanon does have a new government. Do you have confidence that this government is capable of resolving the bank crisis, of digging Lebanon out of debt? And what role do you see the IMF playing in achieving that?
As you know, the IMF is helping Lebanon and the Lebanese people, and we are now looking forward for the formation of the government to engage again with Lebanon, with the authorities, in order to see what are the reform programs and how the fund can help.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
South Africa could be heading toward a debt crisis if it doesn't rein in its spending. Right now, that's a difficult proposition for a nation that needs every penny to combat the pandemic. The country has already agreed to a loan of more than $4 billion from the International Monetary Fund. And as is the case with all loans from the lender of last resort, it comes with strings. The biggest string of all is a debt anchor. That's like a promise not to increase debt to unmanageable levels when it plans its budget. If it doesn't rein in spending, debt could soar to 140% of GDP by the end of the decade. This year, debt could rise to 90% of GDP. The larger your debt, the more money you pay in interest payments, which means there isn't enough money for services or help to create jobs, with unemployment running at more than 30%. The country is also grappling with another problem: corruption. Under former President Jacob Zuma's rule of 9 years, almost $30 billion was allegedly looted from the state. That's according to government estimates. That money right now would be very useful as it unleashes a much-needed $30 billion stimulus program to combat the COVID-19 economic crisis. Joining me now from Johannesburg is Lumkele Patriarch-Mondi. Lumkele is a senior lecturer at the Johannesburg-based School of Economics and Finance, University of the Witwatersrand. Thank you for your time. Going into the global financial crisis in 2008, South Africa had recorded a budget surplus. It came out with a strong balance sheet. Now it's on the verge of a debt crisis. What went wrong in those years?
South Africa had built a buffer to offset any crisis that it could face. Unfortunately for South Africa, the crisis met it undergoing political change, with Zuma together with the left, led by the Communist Party, a faction of the ANC, as well as the youth, who ousted Mbeki and therefore decided to implement a state-led development program under the New Growth Path, and in the process also destroyed and repurposed institutions such as the prosecuting authority, as well as SOEs for private benefit, where Zuma was a patron and the rest of those around him were clients.
OK, was it all just corruption, though? I mean, can we really put it all down to that, misappropriation, or were there other factors at play?
There are other factors. The victors at Polokwane who defeated Mbeki also destroyed the capability of the state. So the state was stripped out of capability. So what we saw was that not only was corruption a political project, but in it was also a destroying of some of the capability that had been built by the black government since 1994. Therefore, we saw collapse of institutions from local level where there have been service delivery protests, because the state cannot meet water delivery, cannot meet service and refuse delivery. So it's been a crisis that was human-made with the Zuma faction. So this corruption, coupled with an incapable state, as well as a very difficult period around destruction of Eskom, where this economy was built on mining and energy, and Eskom inability to deliver energy really worsened the economy together with corruption. So we may say that it was a double-edged sword, where there was corruption on the other side, on one side. On the other side, there was just a collapse of institution due to state incapacity and lack of capabilities.
And then, of course, we have unemployment, which has soared to 30%, but that was going up before the coronavirus pandemic. Taking that into account, where do you see the country headed?
The country is facing huge challenges. We expect with the COVID-19, unemployment in South Africa should be about 40%, which probably will be among the highest among middle-income countries. And many people have been pushed into informality. And in the process of informality, there are also pathologies, because if people are unemployed and they cannot scrape through, crime and other forms of violence increases. That is why South Africa is one of the high crime rate countries, but also very violent countries in the world.
As we mentioned earlier, the government has to introduce a debt anchor as part of the IMF program. What else is required by the IMF, and how is the country going to go meeting those requirements?
The IMF expects South Africa to undergo huge structural economic reforms, specifically reducing support of state-owned enterprises, who all of them need cash injection. from Eskom to the newly built South African Airways that the state is talking to the South African Broadcasting Corporation. So that's one area. The second area is around telecommunication, where the state has kept the spectrum, and hence the difficulty of us communicating in this interview. And thirdly, it's about huge concentration in the economy, particularly in areas where the state is dominant. This is transport and logistics. This is power, the energy generation, where the state through Eskom is very dominant. So these reforms will require the state to play an enabling environment. In that process, hopefully, allow private sector to come in and thrive and succeed. However, we know that because of the state having these assets, it's unlikely to move at the pace it would like to because of vested interests such as trade unions and the communists. Therefore, I think the expectations of the IMF to anchor their support by putting debt into South Africa may found itself failing because it's going to lead to mass action, revolt, because it's being seen by broader society as austerity. So I doubt that the IMF will find these processes being met by the Southern government. We expect Southern government to get deeper into debt and end up having to really undergo a bigger structural adjustment program because it will be able to effect those changes which the IMF expects of them with the loan they've given us of $4.3 billion in the past month.
Okay, yeah, the $30 billion stimulus package proposed by the government, what impact, if any, do you think that will have on the economy?
It's been a very sad story about that package of 30 billion. Remember that 13 billion of that 30 billion was meant to be a loan guarantee backed by the government and the South African Reserve Bank. To date, only about 15% of that has been spent. Therefore, meaning that many corporations have been left alone, they've collapsed, they've been destroyed. And secondly, part of that 30 billion that you've mentioned was going to be part of the borrowing requirement that I've mentioned, the 4.3 billion coming from the IMF, which have just come in now. So it's not been disbursed yet. And others are coming from the budget lines, which already been announced in February. And we know that those have been captured because in the process, the Auditor General of South Africa has reported that there's been huge corruption where money meant for health services has been captured and misspent. People call it stealing for death because that corruption has led to many people dying in South Africa. Although in comparative terms, South Africa has done fairly in terms of deaths due to COVID. However, the fact that the money meant to spend went to corruptions and people's pockets than protective equipment and others is a disaster for South Africa.
We'll have to leave it there for time. Thank you so much for your time, Lumkele Patriarch Mondi. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
The UK Supreme Court is hearing a case that could bring an end to the so-called gig economy. The appeal was brought by Uber after drivers won the right to be recognised as workers and not as independent contractors. Uber has argued that it's a technology company that connects drivers and riders. In a separate case in California, Uber and rival Lyft have been ordered by a judge to classify drivers as employees. It's just one of many cases globally. Drivers and unions claim millions of people in the gig economy have insecure contracts that don't entitle them to sick and holiday pay. Many are unable to save for retirement because of the nature of the work. Well, joining me now from London via Skype is Neil Carberry. Neil is the Chief Executive Officer of the Recruitment and Employment Confederation in the UK. Thanks for your time, Neil. Uber's business model could not just be damaged, but upended, really, if the court rules against them, saying, yes, actually, drivers are employees. What side of the debate do you come down on, especially considering, if this business model changes, who knows what it will mean, the size of the company, its profits, its number of drivers?
So, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to join you. I think this is a really important case because what we have here is a business in Uber who are doing something new, an app-based ride platform, but of course, essentially, in many ways, it is a taxi company. And there are really strong established rules in the UK for when someone is working for themselves and when someone is actually a worker working for an employer. And I think what Uber has learned through this case is that those rules are inflexible for a reason. And I was not surprised when the initial case found for the claimants, because in reality you can't just say someone is self-employed. There are a range of tests in English law that are about the type of work you're doing, and I think if you look across that work, by and large, most people on an even hand would say that Uber drivers were workers by the traditional definition that case law in England sets out. So I wasn't surprised at all by the judgment. Now, for Uber, what does that mean for its business model? Well, it has a choice. It can either move to acknowledging that and build a worker model, or it can arrange how the work is done differently so that it retains a contractor model. That choice is theirs, but they cannot just say that someone is self-employed when in fact they're a worker.
As you sort of mentioned, this has gone through the courts. It's now in the UK going to the final court of appeal, to the Supreme Court. I mean, this could also have implications for all delivery services, for everyone in the gig economy, couldn't it?
Absolutely. And I think what's really important here is there is a very clear test in case law in England for when someone is a worker and when someone is self-employed. And companies need to know it and respect it. And in some cases, there are gig economy companies who are employing people self-employed, and they're clearly self-employed. And in some cases, we've seen examples where that's much more in question, as we've seen in the Uber case. I think what's important here is that companies cannot hide behind the law. They have to make a decision about whether they want people to be workers, and that comes with responsibilities and rights for workers and for companies, or whether they want people to be self-employed. And if they choose self-employment, they can't expect people to do the things that workers can be expected to do. There's a choice there. And I think a lot of these, particularly newer companies, tech and platform-driven companies, have a habit of thinking that they're changing the world with what they're doing. Well, there are reasons why our employment relation systems work the way they do. And it's really important that flexible labour markets, gig working, which is a huge benefit to people in terms of finding work quickly and finding work flexibly, that we maintain the fact that fairness matters in that part of the labour market just as much as it does to people who have an ongoing permanent job working 9 to 5.
As things stand, the likes of Uber and Lyft are not paying taxes, arguing that they're just a connecting technology, not an employer, nor are they contributing to, employee health schemes or anything like that. Meaning the taxpayer essentially has to pick up the tab. I mean, does that add another element to this?
Well, that whole piece around fair competition and around companies paying the appropriate amount of tax, depending on whether they're in kind of what you'd call the traditional economy or in this more app-based economy. We see exactly the same discussion going on here in the UK between bricks and mortar retailers who have to pay a tax called business rates, which is very high, and online retailers who don't have to pay that tax. And of course, they can feed that through to prices. So there is a big debate to have in all countries, I think, about the balance of taxation when you have more companies operating in a disaggregated way, either matching, which is essentially what Uber's platform is doing, approved drivers with customers, or indeed selling in-country or internationally from platforms like Amazon. So I think there is a big debate coming about that. I think it's really important that businesses that are relying on new technology approach that with a sense that responsibility matters and that somewhere the tax is going to have to be paid. I think the work that's been going on at the OECD internationally around trying to find some common ground between nations on how we tax these big global businesses is really, really important to that responsible capitalism that we should all be aiming for.
OK, thank you so much for your time. Neil Carberry, Chief Executive Officer of the Recruitment and Employment Confederation in the UK. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us by tweeting me at Kim Vanel, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on.